Good afternoon, guys. You guys just left me here all alone, and I had nothing better to do than to work up the last day of our class. Today, we're going to talk about the Japanese and also a little bit about Puyi, our good friend. So let's get into it. Our study guide. Now, notice that this study guide is always available to you in Canvas. And so, yeah, let's go. For less than a century, the Japanese had been playing a game of catch up with the Western world. I mean, until 1856, Japan was still living in literally the Dark Ages. And we saw that. Remember, we watched the film The Last Samurai. You saw the archaic ways of the samurai. And now we're learning about China, but trust me, Japan is going to come into this equation. So, Japan wanted what the British had, and that was a colonial empire. And they actually copied how the British did it. Japan wanted to be a modern industrial power, but needed is an island that doesn't have a lot of raw materials. They have a little coal, but outside of that, not much. And so for the Japanese, the only way they could think of to get these was to actually claim parts of other territories to basically, like the British did, build a colonial empire. Japan considered Asia its own little part of the world and was going to use the fact that Britain and France were about to be tied down in a European conflict, aka World War II, by Germany, as a chance to snatch up property. Japan thought it should expand its territorial holdings into China, beginning with the seizures of Manchuria. And actually, this happens in 1931. These are actually the opening hostilities of World War II and not the invasion of Poland. This part of Manchuria they will name Manchukuo and placed, look at this, guys, placed at its head the former Manchu Emperor of China, Henry Puyi. And we're going to visit him again. I'm excited. I like Puyi. I like the last emperor. And that's who they're talking about. Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. 4 years later, the Japanese used a border incident to provoke a war with China, which China had a million man army, but they had no equipment because the Chinese, unlike the Japanese, had not modernized. The Japanese were equipped with a modern fighting force, which was supplied with American gas and American scrap iron, and they made short work of the Chinese army. One of the most tragic events in history was the rape of Nanking. During this war between Japan and China, the city of Nanking in China actually put up a stiff defense. It actually took the Japanese longer than they had expected to actually conquer it. And because of that, and when the city of Nanking surrendered, the Japanese decided to A, punish the city of Nanking, and B, to set an example for the rest of China to make them very afraid. And so, what the Japanese did, they did several things. Number one, they used live human beings to practice bayonet practice. Infantry or enlisted soldiers would practice with bayonets on live human beings. Officers would use their swords to behead people. A lot of officers would have bets to see who could cut the most heads off within a prescribed amount of time. But the worst of all, in my opinion, was the simple fact that the Japanese liked to give their soldiers what they called comfort women, sex slaves. And it was said that in the city of Nanking, that no woman was safe, aged 8 years old to 80, that were, brutalized, raped by Japanese soldiers. Some actually raped to death, and others were raped and then eviscerated. That means they took a sword and just cut up the torso. Now, some of these women were able to escape and slip into American missionary compounds. In other words, these a lot of American missionary Roman Catholics and Baptists and whatever built these walled enclaves within the city of Nanking, and some of the women were able to escape into those enclaves, and they told what was happening. At the time, the United States actually was not. The United States was supplying Japan with the aforementioned gasoline, scrap iron, wood, agriculture products, and those things. And when word of this got out, including evidence, photographs, the United States government got a case of the conscience and told the Japanese that we will no longer sell you stuff, which made the Japanese very, very suspicious of the United States and looked at the United States as a potential threat to their plans of this great colonial empire. Zhang Jieshi, also called, as you know, hopefully, outgunned nationalist Kuomintang, continued to fight the Japanese. And when we watch the film The Last Emperor, you'll hear the word Kuomintang mentioned more than one occasion. The nationalists, they continued to fight the Japanese and gave ground to the Japanese. Mao Zedong's communist rebels also fought the Japanese, and for a while the Kuomintang and the communists called a ceasefire against each other to fight the Japanese. All right, and so we will visit Puyi. In Europe, the authoritarian rulers began to seize territories such as Hitler and Mussolini as the former Allied nations tried a policy called appeasement. Appeasement is when your little brother wants something and he won't shut up, and finally your parents just say, just give it to him. Why? So he'll shut up. That's appeasement. Mussolini felt that Italy was owed territory in Africa, especially Ethiopia. They ordered the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. The Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie asked the League of Nations for help and got nothing outside of a verbal condemnation, just like the Japanese had received from their invasion of China. Britain allowed Italy even to ship supplies for that slaughter through the Suez Canal. Why? Because Britain got paid. Hitler defied the too harsh to be enforced terms of the Versailles Treaty and enlarged the armed forces of Germany and cheated on the other terms in secret, such as training pilots and gliders, hiding soldier deployments, etc. He occupied the Rhineland with German soldiers in complete violation of the Versailles Treaty, and nothing was done. Mussolini, after some initial suspicions against Hitler himself, allied himself with the Germans, a move that the Germans will come to regret. Who were the Axis powers? Primarily, of course, Germany, Italy, and Japan. In Spain, the forces of Generalissimo Francisco Franco challenged the democratic government in the Spanish Civil War. Hitler and Mussolini actually participated in this war and used it as a training ground for their new weapons and battle tactics as they aided the fascist General Franco. In fact, if you look at, I'll show you in my room, there's a painting called Guernica. And that painting was done by Pablo Picasso to protest the bombing of a Spanish town by the Nazis. They bombed a town just for the purpose of testing their new bombers. The democratic nations would not aid the Republican government, and only the Soviet Union sent aid, and they lost. Franco's revolution was too much for the Republican government, and soon Spain was a dictatorship that will last until 1974. And yeah, Guernica. I'll show you the painting when you're in here. The United States was tied up in the Great Depression, conservatism, isolationism, and once again was not prepared for war. Der Anschluss, that was when Germany annexed Austria in 1938. The Sudetenland was a region in the newly created country of Czechoslovakia that had 4 million Germans living in there. Adolf Hitler said, give it to us. Give us the Sudetenland. Czechoslovakia said, hey, I need help here. And so the British and France said, okay, Hitler, let's meet in Munich and we'll talk about it. And at the Munich conference, just like your parents, when your little brother wants something and he won't shut up, they gave Hitler the Sudetenland. And then Hitler proceeded to take everything else. Neville Chamberlain, peace for our time. Neville Chamberlain, after the Munich conference, went back to Britain and said, hey, we did it. We will have peace for our time. He was wrong. And yes, finally, Adolf Hitler and the Soviet Union, two sworn enemies, signed a 10-year non-aggression pact between the two. Basically, what they signed was the death warrant of the nation of Poland. And we'll get to that. And look at that. We're at end all of a sudden. And I hope that I'm still recording. And yes, I am.